when I lived in the Atlanta metropolitan area. I lived about 5 or 6 miles outside of the city's perimeter. And I used to drive into the city, to the Midtown area, to go to a church that I knew by reputation and that I really loved. I did, though, have a small United Methodist church that was just behind the apartment complex where I lived. And I had a coworker who had been a longtime member of that church with her family. And another coworker said to me one day, "You know, I know that you drive a long way to go to church, but you should give that little church that's behind you a try sometime." Well, one year on Easter Sunday morning, my automobile was in the shop for some extensive repairs, and I did not have any transportation that morning. I thought about possibly calling someone I went to church with to pick me up, which was an option. But because it was Easter, I thought, well, let me give this little church behind me a try. I found out from my coworker that they had an Easter sunrise service, followed by a light breakfast. And so I walked to the church that morning. And the church was small, and they had a small cemetery right next to it. It's a cemetery that was over 100 years old. And there were people buried in that cemetery whose descendants were a part of that church now. And that's where they had the Easter sunrise service. So I attended the service, and the pastor led it, and we sang in the garden and sort of the familiar things that you would do at the sunrise service. And afterwards, I made my way into the fellowship hall for the breakfast. I went through the line, I had my little fruit cup and my cup of coffee, and I sat down. And during this entire time, no one spoke to me. Now, at the time, I was dressed casually, which I normally did. I had on jeans and an polo shirt, but I was certainly clean, and my hair smelled. But no one said a word. Then I saw my coworker, and I spoke to her, and she to me. And she was sitting down with her family on the other end of the table from where I was. It was then that a member of his church finally addressed me. It was a woman who was sitting across the table and down a couple of seats from me. And she looked at me and asked, "Who are you?" And rather sheepishly, I told her who I was. And needless to say, I did not go back there until it was to see my coworker get married in that church. This church had been in that location for a very long time. And over the course of time, the suburban area had grown up around it. Directly across the street from there, there was this kind of cookie-cutter suburban neighborhood where every house looked like the one next to it. Right behind it was the apartment complex where I lived, and on either side of those were 2 other apartment complexes. And they were just a mile from where the new high school was going to go into place. My coworker and a handful of people in that church did try to tell people this is a wonderful opportunity, as all of these new people are moving in, and we have an opportunity to expand our ministry and be in ministry with these people who are now our neighbors. But the vast majority of people in that church just lamented that we are no longer this cozy church out in the country like we used to be. And now the city has just encroached on our territory. Churches don't necessarily set out to be rude and inhospitable. It comes from a certain coziness that relates to having our own support network of people that are close to us. And that can lead to being insular. And over time, if we don't keep that in check, it can lead to an unnecessary defensiveness over those who are surrounding us. Now, as long as people who grew up in that church got married there and stay there and raise their children in that church, it will continue to be in ministry. It won't be large. It will always be small, but it will continue to be there. If, though, the economy is such so that people have to move out of the area, or times change as they have, where people who grew up in church for various reasons decide they don't want to be involved with the institutional church, then a little church like that is in trouble. In the very early days of the Christian church, people met in the homes of one of the members. They sat around the table and they had a meal. And at the end of that meal, they would bring out the cup of wine. And they would bring out bread to break. And they would remember what Jesus instituted on the night that he was betrayed. The early church would have been a mixed bag of people who normally would not have interacted with one another in everyday society, except in areas of commerce or civic engagement. It involved people who could have been fairly wealthy, business owners, people who were tradespeople. It could have involved people who were Roman citizens and people who were not, who were subjects of Rome. It could have involved people who were initially from a pagan background and people who were originally from a Jewish background. It could have involved people who were financially well off and those who were slaves. And they all came together around the table of fellowship. And they sang hymns together. And they prayed for one another. And they read from the Old Testament. And they read and reflected on texts such as this epistle of 1 John we read today. And they all came together over the elements of bread and the cup. The writer of 1 John talks about love as being one of the factors that bonds the early church. And love is something that cannot exist in the abstract. We must have a direct object to love. Sometimes we talk about loving things, but that's normally a figure of speech and oftentimes an overstatement. Sometimes, nobly, we will talk about loving certain ideals like justice or liberty. But most of all, we love people. We love those who are close to us. And for the writer of 1 John, Jesus Christ is the ultimate embodiment of God's love. Jesus is born to the poorest of the poor. He is born to people who are subjects, not citizens of an empire. He works as a laborer, as his earthly father Joseph did. And he lives homeless, depending on the charity and support of those around him throughout his public ministry. And he is executed in the way that non-Roman citizens were executed, brutally dying, hanging on a cross. From his birth to his death, Jesus embodies the love that God has for us. John talks about Jesus' birth in this passage as a birth of both water and blood. And I take that as a reference to his physical birth, a birth that throughout natural childbirth means most everyone experiences. That is the way in which Jesus enters into human history, and God's love is embodied and born. And the writer of 1 John is connected with the same community that gives us the Gospel of John. And if we reflect on the two, we see how this birth of water and blood goes through the ministry of Jesus and the way he embodied God's love. The pain of labor that Mary feels when Jesus is born and the blood comes from her is reflected in the blood that flows from Jesus as he dies bleeding and suffering on a cross. And the water that also comes from her during that moment of anguish is reflected in the salt of her tears as she stands at the foot of the cross and watches her firstborn child die. Jesus Christ remains the embodiment of God's love. And for early Christians and for us, these elements of bread and the cup embody that for us. As we gather around this table to take into ourselves God's love and to be God's loving community for others. It is important for us in our setting to remember the environment in which the early church was founded. An environment in which culture did not support them, and in some cases the environment was threatening to the development of the Christian church. But their ability to come together over the bond of love given through Christ and represented in the bread and the cup is what made them strong and made the early church to grow. If we fall into that temptation to become close to one another and to become insular, then we cut ourselves off from God's love. There are many different ways in which we can share God's love with other people. And I've said throughout this week and on a number of occasions, you are a church that's very good at loving other people and being hospitable. I have seen witness to this, and it's been shared with me by other people. You have welcomed people into your homes with the blessing of the home that we had at Donna's last week. You've brought neighbors and friends to come to the blessing of the animals. You've invited other people to come to the prayer breakfast on Saturday and other events that we've hosted. Tomorrow morning we will have a mingling with the children of the preschool, where those of you who have been praying for a preschool child and the families of that preschool child will have an opportunity to sit with them and talk about what that experience has been like. And when you go to that, you might want to invite them, if they do not have a church home, to come back and join us for worship on Sunday. Or maybe give them a couple of tickets to the country breakfast next week. One of the things that we talked about in our Choosing the Faithful Path work group is, like that small church I mentioned early on, we are surrounded by neighbors whom we largely do not know. But one of the ways that the people of this neighborhood come into and interact with this church is that country breakfast. And I've invited you from the pulpit and in writings in the newsletter to engage with people when they come to this breakfast, to sit down and to talk with them if there are people you don't know, to find out if they have a church home, and if not, to invite them to be a part of this one. And if they do, find out what church they're involved with and what sort of ministries they have going on there. And is there something that we can keep in mind prayerfully for some future sort of partnership? And ask the people in this neighborhood, is there something you want from Northview Church? Is there some sort of service we can provide, or is there something we can do for you? At the very least, offer to pray for them. Offer to take their concerns to God if there's something that is weighing on their heart. And if you're particularly bold, you are welcome to bow your head and pray for them there at the breakfast table. One of the things we talked about in the work group and that I've asked you to do is to have these conversations and to get back to me with what you've learned from people and what they've had to say from you. And so far, I have heard nothing. So I am bringing this before you again. This is another opportunity for us to share God's love with other people and to learn that the hospitality that we enjoy is something that, if not shared, can even stifle us from experiencing God's grace. Talk with and interact with your neighbor this week. Find out who they are and let them know who you are. Let them know that you are a praying and loving member of this church. And invite them to be a part of this congregation and its ministries in whatever way can fit them. It is the invitations that we extend over that breakfast table that leads to the fellowship that comes with this day. Amen.